All right, well, good morning, everybody. It's Joe Mo Stewart here at the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. Actually, we have quite a few additional folks. So it's myself, we have Mr. Mayor Ward, we also have Mr. Roger Burgraff, of course. So let me start my, I don't know how that stops. Hey, there we go. All right, and so yes, it's about 8 o'clock in the a.m. here at the Energy for All Alaska Task Force, a bit of a special presentation today. There's an ordinance that is in the offing. We've never really discussed this directly here at the task force, but really our Civ Mill housing discussions. They've been, I think everyone is aware of them, but those discussions are ongoing, predominantly driven by the arrival of the F-35s, but really it's a broader issue than that. A lot of our housing stock, as most of us know, there's a good portion of it that was built quite a while ago. We also have a lot of places could really use some infill around our community. One place that comes to mind for me always is South Cushman, that has kind of got a reputation of being a high density area. But if you drive around with a little bit more discerning eye, you can see that there are quite a few empty lots there. And in fact, if you went and hydroaxed through there, you'd find there's quite a bit of space for building. But in any case, again, we have an ordinance that has been proposed by Presiding Officer O'Neall, who is our main guest, as well as Mayor Ward and Assemblywoman Wilson, to offer some tax breaks to help stimulate the building that we can use around this community. And so I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jomo. And thanks for everyone for being here and your interest in this ordinance. We had a work session on Thursday with some really good, robust discussion about the ins and outs of this, and then Thursday will be a public hearing. So if this is something that you want to support, we'd love to hear from you in the chambers on Thursday. And you can still testify online or just send an email too, that helps. So as Jomo mentioned, myself, along with Assemblywoman Wilson and Mayor Ward, worked on this ordinance together. And, Jomo, next slide. To add that into my speech. So I think it's a good exercise to overview kind of where our assessment of housing is in the past and kind of where we're going with this ordinance. And throughout this presentation, you'll see there are several times we cite comprehensive plans, regional growth plans, community plans that highlight a housing issue that communities have recognized, as well as solutions to how we address that. So, the takeaway here is that we've known that we've had a quality of housing stock issue in our communities for a while. And now that we have a larger mission from the military coming in, these well-known and documented housing issues are really exacerbated. And so, we know that housing is the cornerstone of a stable community. You can build hospitals, roads, schools, you can build restaurants, but if there isn't good housing for individuals to live in, it's going to be tough to support all of those other entities. We can expect to see additional constraint in the housing market. That was through the regional growth plan based on the Eielson Air Force Base expansion. Efficient and affordable large multifamily housing developments have not been constructed in the community in the last 10 to 20 years. And we'll get into some specific details, numbers on just showing you what that looks like. And this really does threaten the economy and driving up housing costs and affecting the mission of our bases. And so in the regional growth plan, it was noted that a targeted tax exemption program is one strategy that can kind of help address this issue broad term. Next slide. In addition, there are quite a few market stressors that are putting downward pressure on the situation. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, a well-known limited Arctic building season, the timing of the F-35 personnel and Air Force Base, and the future personnel arrivals of the KC-135 mission. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected our supply chain. If you were on earlier, before this meeting started, we were having a little bit of a conversation about how the supply chain has recovered, as well as the labor markets, but it's still tight out there. And I think with the addition of added infrastructure and CARES and ARPA funding that is coming through our community, we'll continue to see that. Next slide. So the North Pole Comprehensive Strategic Plan noted that they had a goal to advocate for updates to their land use and zoning designations, along with strategies such as rezoning, encouraging development and aligning with current use, as well as an increase of two-family residential and multifamily residential areas in the central city locations to increase density and quality. Next slide. Additionally, the FNSB Regional Comprehensive Plan of 2005 also notes that energy efficient land with higher densities and clustered housing is a land use goal, and details how to get there with by encouraging residents to by encouraging measures that provide residents access to safe and affordable housing. And it also noted, that specialized housing to meet income needs of people with disabilities, elderly, and other populations is also a need in our community. Next slide. The 2016 Borough Comprehensive Economic Strategy noted that affordable housing has important implications for economic development. High housing prices affect the quality of life for individuals and their families of our community. And talking about the proximity of the base and the drive times, noting the location of where these houses could be focused on is really what led us to our ordinance today. Next slide. And additionally, the Senior Needs Assessment of 2019 also noted the lack of quality, low income or affordable housing, as well as the increase of the amount of units that are needed in pretty short order, based on the Mayor Ward, help me out here. What do they call it? The silver wave? Is that what they call it? Silver wave coming up. Nope, I'm putting you on the spot. He's like, I don't know. It's the wave of individuals who are reaching all of the baby boomers who are reaching ages that are needed for senior housing, and that's a real large portion of our community. Next slide.
So sorry, we were muted. Mayor Ward said the silver tsunami is the term.
Yeah, that's what it is. I thought it had a little bit more of a jingle to it than just silver wave. So yeah.
And I'll be honest, I just was speaking to my mother yesterday, and she was telling me that my aunt just had her 70th birthday. And I swear I just didn't really realize my mom was so old. Just in my mind's eye, she's always, but in my mind's eye, she's, ever about 35, 40, yeah.
Oh yeah. Time's going fast, and even faster when we're locked in a pandemic, right? So, next slide. Oh, could you go back? Maybe.
Oh, yes.
Oh, whoops. Maybe one more slide. Sorry.
Yes.
Finally, the AHFC Housing Assessment of 2018, where the Executive Director and CEO, Brian Butcher, noted that the current rate of construction just isn't keeping pace with the projection of Alaska's population. And again, noting that senior beds is increasing as our population increases. Next slide. So we all know and support the increase of mission to our community, and want to support the incoming personnel as well as with their families. And so to give you an idea of what we expect, 226 F-35 personnel but that are coming right now. And when we calculate what the need is to that amount of people, it doesn't quite equate to one face per person. But so that's why you see this little lower number of housing demand, but we're looking at 136 unit demand with that deployment. Next slide. Additionally, when we look at the increase of the KC 135 personnel coming in using that same sort of evaluation, this is, this helps us understand the need of the demand in our community. Next slide. So I noted that we would kind of look at these numbers. So in the past 3 years, our construction averages have looked at 115 in the 99705 area, 102 units in the Fairbanks area, and 10 in the Salcha area. So, we are increasing our housing stock. This is to incentivize a short burst of concentrated housing stock. Next slide. Colonel Crum has been a really big advocate in supporting the borough and helping us determine what and how we can fit the needs of the community. And he testified last year in front of the legislature about our situation and the need for incentivization to build homes. Next slide. Okay, let's get into the ordinance. So
actually, Miss O'Neall, if you don't mind, do we have any questions at this juncture? Mr. Soley.
Thank you, Ms. O'Neall. Back to your metric on the 0.6 units per phase, kind of, for both the KC 135s and the F-35s. Is there general agreement amongst folks that that's an appropriate metric? That probably comes out of some statistical agency. Just trying to make sure that I'm going to track then with you on these figures.
Yeah, thanks for the question. As noted on that slide, that's the Air Force Base 354th Mission Support Group, as well as the Regional Growth Plan. So it does, it is a shared metric.
Thank you.
Mindy, did you want me to maybe talk to that a little bit, give further explanation?
Sure.
The 0.6 factor is what we see based on the regional growth plan. It's also what we see in the numbers based on the personnel that have arrived. It's possible that could shift a little bit with the KC 135, depending on the type of personnel that arrive. But generally speaking, 0.6 to 0.7 is where we see, when we look at Fort Wainwright, we look at Eielson, and the general makeup that comes with any kind of base growth. That's the factor we see. Even our own community, it's actually lower than that. So when we look at total population, the number of units that we've got a population of 100,000. We don't have 100,000 houses. Is kind of the example that we've given in the past. So
okay.
It may fluctuate a little bit as to 0.6 or 0.66 or 0.7, but generally speaking, that's gonna move your numbers 10 or 15 units, looking at the numbers that we've got here. So not anything that's
okay
outside.
Yeah, but I think the important thing is what Mindy said too, was that this was a metric that was came out of joint, both the mission support group and the borough. So I'm just wanting to find that kind of agreement. So then similarly on the number of units constructed over the last few years, that's no disagreement on those are appropriate for counting in this, the 226 or 227, I guess it is. I'm just wanting to make sure I'm tracking with all the numbers. Okay, because it gets me back to what you're saying the need is, and this is what we've been doing. It looks like we've been doing about on par with what we should be.
So I mentioned we've been having robust discussions, sorry, Mr. Mayor. We've been having robust discussions on this issue for some time. So there is a housing task force. It's a rather large group. It includes builders, bankers, administrators, the military. Under that, there is a data group. So there's constant, continuous conversation between the special assistant of the mayor, the military bases, the realtors, to make sure that we have a firm handle as possible on these numbers, the best possible projections as far as growth, who's coming in when, and making sure that these factors are, again, at least a good rule of thumb and better as you know, as the data comes in.
Thank you.
These particular data, this data set comes from our assessing data too. So it's boots on the ground, what we've been observing.
Thank you.
Now, Miss Lisa, I see that your hand's up.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I just had a quick question. So when we're looking at the houses being built or constructed, units construct, I guess is the term. Does that also include like just general influx of population for non-military personnel? Like, does that combine the military and the non-military that are inbound? Not related to the military missions?
Are you
I can
talking
take
about
that.
the units, or are you talking about the population that's expected?
Just are we keeping up with, like, I know we're on target to meet the military influx based on Mayor Ward's presentation of the chamber a few weeks ago, that there'll be a constraint this summer, but I'm just wondering, do all of these studies also include an estimated, if we do have influx of non-military personnel or non-related F-35, KC-135, will we then have another issue, or is that also kind of considered with our growth population? And maybe we're not planned to grow. I'm not sure.
It's okay. So Lisa, I'll take a first crack and then I'm gonna hand it over to Mayor Ward. I can tell you at the very, very beginning. So you see down in the lower left, there's the 2018, regional growth plan. One of the very first exercises, I believe, with Agnew Beck was figuring out kind of trying to ascertain what our normal organic need was, and our normal organic growth, so that we could, so that when you're talking about these units, we're talking about additive. How much would we need above that normal baseline to meet this incoming flow of personnel and people? Mayor Ward?
Yeah, so there's some really interesting things that happen with the population. So if you go back now, I guess almost 20 years ago, or no, 10 years ago, the last census, 2010, our population was up over 100,000. And so when you look at what's happened over the last 10 years, with the exception of the last few years, our actual population has been declining in the Fairbanks North Star Borough. And that was part of the projections that were used for the regional growth plan to look at how much capacity we had in the market. Now, obviously, by the market conditions now that supply and demand is out of whack. There's not enough supply, yet our population is still 4,000 or 5,000 people down from what it was at its peak 10 years ago. So another good indicator when you look into the data is what's happening with the schools, where we have less and less students in the district. We have less and less young people in the borough. So one of the things that we're seeing, we haven't quite got our hands around this yet, is that as we've aged over the last 10 to 15 years, the family makeup and the makeup of our population has shifted as well. So that's what's happened is maybe you've had a family of 4 in 2010, which needed 1 unit. Now you've maybe have a family of 3 or a family of 2. So that means for the same number of people, you need more units. So that's another nuance to all of this that's certainly impacting the numbers that we don't necessarily have a really good handle on. But there's changes in our demographics that are happening that are impacting this as well.
Thanks.
All right. Seeing no more questions, Madam Presiding Officer, I think we can proceed.
Okay, so starting with the ordinance, then encouraging multifamily developments, 5 units or more, to be built. So that's an objective. Shorter term exemptions are included for units 1 through 4 to increase development and address fiscal concerns that our community may be facing, or builders may be facing in that criteria. that incentivize it, it includes an energy efficiency standard. So we're requiring that there's a high level of energy efficiency built into the plans. And this is a case by case basis. So we'll get into the application process, but generally the assembly has to approve every application with after it's run through the assessor's office and with the recommendation of the assessor. Next slide. So the boundaries, section 2 and 3 talk about the boundaries. We included the boundaries of the city of North Pole and the city of Fairbanks. So the city of North Pole includes the military facility zone with the intent that should we get a military facility zone designation within the city of Fairbanks area, that would also be included in this ordinance. That is still forthcoming. So we've been asked a lot about why these boundaries, and I'll tell you, it's probably one of, and Mayor Ward would agree with me, this is probably one of the biggest conversations we've had when developing this ordinance of where the boundaries are. But really, we really want to make a focused attempt based on an area that we know needs and qualifies for economic development that will increase density. And the easiest, and you know, I guess that's really what it came down to. The best way for us to do that was with the boundaries of the city limits of North Pole and Fairbanks. Mayor Ward, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think some of the other components to that are the cities have strong building codes. So when we look at these bigger type of buildings and this type of construction, we want to ensure it's done to a high quality and high standard. So that was certainly a piece of it. Generally speaking, the cities have pretty high capacity for utilities. And so that also supports that higher density. But then again, we had to provide some sort of geographic boundary to this. And the city limits was one that was easy and clear for people to understand. We didn't want to make it terribly complicated for builders to have to figure out, you know, okay, am I in this area? Am I not in this area? If I do this work and then go through this application process, is it possible that I'm not going to qualify somehow? So very clear boundaries so that folks have a very clear understanding what the needs are for the application.
A constant theme that I have received from you all, both in preliminarily hearing about your draft, but also in the discussion at the Finance Committee last week, was that it was meant to be focused, limited to achieve clearly defined goals regarding construction of residential units here in our community. So limited by geography, trying to encourage building in those places that would be most impactful for the broader community, both service members and residents. The kind of structures that you're trying to encourage development of, things that weren't historically being built that we want to encourage. So focused, limited, to incentivize a fairly narrow band of a high need. Is that fair?
Well said, Jomo.
Okay, sorry. So do you want to discuss section 3? Because we talked
sure.
about section 2.
Yep, thanks. So so this includes new construction only. We didn't include remodels or refurbishing of any sort of properties in this ordinance. We wanted it to be as straightforward as possible. And so for, like mentioned before, 5 units and over, and then units under 5, there are 2 different types of exemptions. And you know, this will, you know, so if you have a property and you already have a structure on that property and you intend to build under this exemption, the exemption would apply only to the new construction on your property. Next slide.
So Mindy, that would that mean you could complete demo of a property and then that would include new construction, or is it like you have to build in a separate area, a brand new construction?
Do you mean like completely take down one structure and then build it back up?
Yes. Would that include the exemption?
I think so. What do you think, Ward?
Yeah, Mindy, so if you had a property, let's say you had an old house on it and you want to tear that down and build something new, then all of the new value would be included. But if you had let's say you had a duplex and you want to add another duplex behind it, the new duplex would qualify for any one of these exemptions. The old one would not.
Okay, great. I was just making sure because we have so many, if it was a complete tear down and rebuild, that would count, because especially within Fairbanks, there's a lot of property that could utilize a complete tear down and rebuild.
Absolutely. That's one thing that we hear a lot about is, well, there's no place to build and within the city limits. And it's really that we have properties that could be demolished and we could build on lots of property in these city limits.
So is there any thought to incentivizing or giving any sort of, I don't know what you would call it, I don't live in that world, but an incentive to tear down those either the non-adequate housing so that people would have a more incentive to tear those down and rebuild as well? Or is it just all or one?
I think that it's part of the conversation. This is just one ordinance that starts to put in incentives to build, and there's certainly ways that we can incentivize deteriorated properties.
Yeah, just to add to that, so there is a deteriorated exemption section in code that I think fits really nicely with this. This is more lucrative than the current options in code right now. So if someone was interested in a piece of land that had a deteriorated property on it that they wanted to demo, I think this certainly helps pencil out that incentive. At this point, there's nothing on the books that does anything other than waive code or waive the tax requirement, give that exemption, with the exception that some properties may be eligible for a tipping fee waiver at the landfill. But that, again, has to go through a process where the building has to be condemned by the fire marshal, either the state or the city fire marshal. But there's certain conditions that would allow that tipping fee waiver that could be coupled with this with an appropriate application.
Any further follow-up, Lisa?
Nope. Thanks for allowing me to contribute, Gemma.
My pleasure. Thanks. We appreciate everyone's contribution. All right, so Ms. O'Neall.
Next slide. So this is just a reminder of our powers of how we can do this. There's existing code, that's state code that allows local municipalities to put in tax exemptions based on the way our second-class borough is set up. This is done under the Economic Development Tax Code, and so that really means that we have to show that this is an area of need that's different than the general population, and that's goes back to our boundaries. Next slide. So 5 units or more, there's a maximum of 10 years of a possible exemption, and units 1 through 4, a maximum of 2 years property tax exemption. And it's important to note that the exemptions are limited to the city of Fairbanks, North Pole, and military facility zones, but also that North Pole has an exemption in their code that says if the borough exempts a tax, then it's automatically exempted from their local taxes. However, the city of Fairbanks would still need to make a change in their ordinance. So if you're or in their code. So if you're building in the city of Fairbanks, this property may still be subject to any city of Fairbanks taxes. Next slide. So the application must be included prior to construction. Applications after construction are not allowed. The deadline is the end of the year, 2023. Again, a very short amount of time, a very condensed location to really focus density and quality of housing. And then the assessor has 30 days to submit completed applications with a recommendation to the Assembly. The Assembly will then take it up and approve or deny the application. Next slide. So there must be, within the application, the criteria shows that there must be a demonstrated need for cost, the type of construction, it must fit the criteria. As mentioned before, entirely new residential units only. It must be completed construction within 2 years of approval. It must include living, sleeping, and cooking provisions. It needs to be owner occupied or leased for periods of at least 1 month. And the proposed term of the exemption is proportionate to the development's benefit. Next slide. The exemption is granted for units 1 through 4 after the foundation is constructed in January of the following year, and for units 5 and above after completion of construction. So the way that the tax year runs is January 1st of every year, the tax assessments come out for the year. So if there was an application that came through this year, and the exemption was granted, then it would start January 1st, 2024. Next slide, please. The borough does hold the ability to terminate an application, an approved application, if the final construction is less than the number of units that was approved at the time of application, if the property is used for anything other than residential purposes, or if there's any sort of failure of any conditions that were put on the application at approval. Next slide. And there are exclusions. So if the property is already receiving optional tax exemptions, deferrals, or credits, the exemption precludes any sort of other optional tax exemption or incentive to be applied to the property. Next slide.
So no layering or double dipping.
Right, unfortunately. We do require that there's an annual report submitted to the Borough Assembly on the progress of the property. This is really an accountability purpose, so we're able to see is the occupancy and the vacancy of the residential units being met based on the application approval. The certification that the newly constructed residential units exist and they haven't been converted to something other than residential use. There is a description of any sort of physical changes or improvements that have happened since the last report. And then if there are any sort of criteria that the assessor requires, that information needs to be included, and those reports are due March 15th of each year. Next slide, please. Transfer of ownership is allowed for units 5 and above if the transfer was included in the application at approval, and if the new owner agrees to comply with all the conditions also set for approval. Next slide. So our final takeaways here, housing is really a cornerstone of our community and an important important industry for us to manage the mission of the military as well as the needs of our own community. Developers must apply for the exemption before the construction exists, go through the application process through the assessor's office, and provide required information. Units 1 through 4 are eligible for a 2-year tax exemption. Units 5 and above are eligible for up to 10 years of a tax exemption. We include an energy efficiency standard, and all exemptions will be final approval by the Assembly. Applications must be submitted by December 31st of 2023. And it is important to know that the exemptions defer the tax base. But the projects are not reducing the tax base because they're only on improvements. And tax exemptions must be separately authorized by the city of Fairbanks for their portion of taxes. And that's our ordinance, and that's the presentation, and look forward to any discussion or questions.
Okay, we are going to open it up to questions, but I would like to linger just for a moment on the 5-unit plus development. Mayor Ward, you gave a very interesting bit of historical information regarding the size of the units. Are you prepared to maybe walk through that again?
Yeah, so when we look at the assessing data that we have, in the North Pole area in particular, only 1 unit had been constructed since 2000 that was greater than 5 units. In the city of Fairbanks, I want to say it's 1 to 2 units have been constructed since 2000. So that's almost 20 some years. And if you go back, the last time that we saw any considerable construction of multifamily units was back in the 70s. That goes both for the city of Fairbanks and the city of North Pole. Since that time, we just have not seen those larger scale developments. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Regulatory is probably part of it, but cost is another factors in the market. So that's really, when we look at that 5-unit greater development, we were specifically targeting an area that the market is currently not responding to. And I think just to add to Ms. O'Neill's comments on the intent behind the ordinance, it's really to be additive. We know we build about 220 some units, 250 units in the borough every year. This is meant to build on top of that. So we're still expecting our community to respond with the work that they've already been doing on single family duplex, triplex, fourplexes. But we need more if we want to get ahead of the supply issues that we're seeing with housing, and feel that the time window that's provided here with the ordinance is appropriate to get that short-term incentive to benefit the community in the long run, even at the cost of that exemption over the life of those exemptions.
Mr. Solly?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mayor Ward, thanks for talking a little bit about that. So just to ask about then kind of the need, that's what you're referring to. And so in the presentation, the need that would need to be established, what's the actual, who determines the need? Is it the assembly? Is it the recommendation of staff? And I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around the quantitative determination versus the subjective, because if we're meeting the needs so far of housing, then where does the need exist from a quantitative standpoint? Is it that we haven't done any 5+ units? And so the study itself would show that. I'm just wanting to make sure of the difference between a subject determination and a quantitative, I guess.
So that's the kind of the crux of the issue right now. And part of that is that we don't track, a lot of this data has not been tracked consistently over time. So we have new construction data, we have rental vacancy data that goes back all the way to the pipeline days when we started tracking that with the regional quarterly. But what we don't have is some of these population makeups I talked about, so the shift in dynamics of the population and how that impacts housing. What we know is boots on the ground right now, there is a shortage of supply. We know that we've got roughly 200 F-35 personnel, a little bit less than that now, some have arrived since then, that are coming into the community. And for the KC-135, we know that we got about 220. Actually, the last number that I got from the SATAP last week was about 250 personnel that they'd like to bring in as part of that mission. That's just what we know are on the books right now. You look at the senior needs assessment, which calls for another 150 units over the next 3 years. You look at other factors in the market to include our turnover of old stock, just the churn that needs to happen as part of just normal operations, housing that expires that needs to be reconstructed. You also have large scale developments such as Birchwood, which is slated to be demoed in 2027, 2028 as part of the Army taking back that lease, which is another 400 some units. So as we look to the future, there's a
And
really.
you mentioned the Army and the fact that their quality of life upgrades on the bases have been putting extra personnel out into the community.
So, and those are definitely short-term
Mhm.
concerns, I think, that we have been seeing the impacts on the market. The other thing to add to this too, that was not mentioned in this particular presentation, but as part of the military discussions, is right now at Eielson Air Force Base, the privatized housing contractor is managing roughly 1,000 units. Per their contract, that actually is supposed to be, over the last several years, was supposed to be reduced. And so they have kept those houses online with the understanding that we've had this constriction in the market. And the Air Force has indicated that should there be an excess of supply in the market, that they can start to take units offline. They've got about 600 that they said they're willing to start to go through that process on. So there's a couple governors, if you will, that are built into this. And there's benefits, right? When we take housing off the installation, put it into the community, it becomes taxable at a higher value. We incorporate those personnel into the community better. They have better quality of life. We have better integration with the installations. So there's a lot to benefit to moving those folks into the community. And for us to take this on, there's a long-term interest for us to say, military personnel, you should live in the community, not on the installation.
Yeah. Okay. So there's really more housing numbers that are included in the overall totals than that 236 that we had for the need for F-35s and KC-135s and the 227. Really, the number is more like 600 something. If you take the senior need and the just the kind of the stuff that falls off the stock because it's old. And that's where we get into this shortage. I guess, is that?
Yeah, and it's, I will say that we've been a little myopic in the last few years, looking solely at the military, looking at the need that we have. And I think Lisa's comments were kind of to this tune as well, that, there's more than just military that happens in Fairbanks, although that is a very big portion of some of the growth that we've seen over the last few years. But yeah, I think certainly there's other factors that in the ordinance that Ms. O'Neall has here is really trying to incorporate the senior need, the affordability aspect. And that's data that's just really hard to get. We haven't tracked that. Although the comprehensive economic development strategy says that housing is a cornerstone of our community, we haven't necessarily viewed it that way in the past. We've kind of viewed it as an
De facto,
right? Yeah.
So how many units do you expect to be built under the provisions of this legislation, of the ordinance?
I have my number, Mindy. I don't know if you want to share what you think, but if you're looking for like, what do we expect to meet the demand?
Yeah, expect or goal, whichever.
Yeah. I would hope to see at least a 50% increase in the numbers that we're building over the next 2 years. Mindy, I'm not sure if you have kind of an idea.
Wow. That's
I
big.
mean, other than just anecdotally what I think, I mean, it'll be interesting to see who wants to take advantage of this one tool in the toolbox to get to where we need to go.
Okay.
Now, for the record, there are other tools in the toolbox. We're very happy to say. It's taken a while, but over the span of the last year, AHFC has stepped up. They do have a proposal on the street that provides special financing within military facility zones. It lets them step a little bit outside the bounds of their normal lending. That's good. ADA has just stepped up. Their board just last week on Thursday authorized the executive director to start working on this issue here in the community, again, within the military facility zone. And so, in fact, I just got another call from them yesterday, trying to figure out how they can, because that ADA doesn't normally they're not in the residential housing building game. But what they do is some of the pre-development stuff, almost like at Red Dog where they built the road. But here in this community, they're having discussions about how they might help take a piece of undeveloped land and put in some of that infrastructure that would make it more desirable for development, things like roads, utilities. doing the preliminary subdividing and things like that. So it's good. I mean, this is our community stepping up on this issue in the same way that now we have other entities stepping up.
Yeah. There may be other questions I could
Sure.
continue asking if there's.
So we're not trying to monopolize it here in the room. I see, yes, Miss Lisa, your hand's up.
Sorry, I guess I'm with Rick monopolizing all the questions.
No,
I guess
no,
I have
no,
two questions. Jomo, you sent out an email that had indicated that there has already been some opposition to this ordinance. And I was wondering if there's a summary of kind of what that opposition is. And so I just forgot my second question, but I guess I'll ask that one first, and then think if I can remember my other one.
Sure. So when this was first brought forward before the Assembly for first reading, I had gone to testify, to be supportive, but also to just report to the Assembly that, again, Ada had just taken action earlier in the day. But a person slipped in front of me in the testimony line. They had actually come for a different subject and just kind of mentioned as an aside that they opposed tax breaks. Really, it was and this is not an unreasonable argument, but that it's one of those, if not for me, then not for thee. Why are you talking about potentially giving tax breaks for new development when you're not giving me a break on my taxes? But the reality is, so I did ask the borough if there were any examples of where a tax break had helped encourage, beneficial development. And actually, the example is Raven Landing. Which one of us wouldn't want to live now or in the future in Raven's Landing, but which one of us would have wanted to live in the old Fairview Manor that used to be sitting there? It was actually part of what helped get that project over the line on a financial basis was a 10-year tax break on that property. And again, so Raven Lake, we had an old, ugly, derelict, blighted property, which was the old Fairview Manor, where we now have some really top-notch, high-quality residential dwellings in the same area. Again, that's what it was the old, again, the gentleman was like, if I'm not getting a tax break, no one should.
Sure. I guess then my other question would be the whole risk factor of build it and they will come. And so have we started to really address the risks that these developers are taking on, outside of the tools in the toolbox? I mean, the personnel are coming, but again, there's never a guarantee.
So if I could speak to that one. So I think you're certainly right, Lisa, that a lot of folks have spoken to the need to have guarantees if they want to have guaranteed housing. So if you want me to build a 20-unit complex, then I need to have some sort of guarantee that that those units are going to be filled. Well, we can't do that. Military said that they're not going to do that. But what we can do is provide this exemption, which, in some way a guarantee, right? You are guaranteeing that you're not going to be paying that portion of taxes, which will impact your cash flow over that period of time. So to the degree that we can do what we can, I think this is the most that we can do. I do think it's also a pretty lucrative example of what the community is willing to put forward should the Assembly approve this. The reality is there's a pretty high demand on the market right now for units. And if you look at the type and the quality of those units, it gives you a greater additional buffer, understanding that some of your lower quality stuff may fall off the market. And that's part of, you need to either update those things or you need to look at those capacities as well. So I think that all kind of plays into that aspect of it. The other thing I would say too is that we have to recognize that we're in a competitive market right now when we look at builders and we look at developers and investors. And I've taken calls to this last week on folks from our local community that have said, yeah, I'm not really, I've done investment in Fairbanks. I've kind of been looking elsewhere, been looking in the Anchorage market. I've been looking at other markets where the rate of return is greater. But they said, I'm actually really interested in this because it changes the dynamic. It makes it more competitive now to look at doing a development in Fairbanks versus like an Anchorage or some other market. So we're toying with things for sure. This is influencing the market. It's really looking at targeted incentives in areas we feel are most appropriate to help meet that need.
So if you do this program for, I guess, 10 years, or the exemption is for 10 years, the program itself would only be, do you have a sunset on it? I actually didn't see that in the presentation, and I didn't.
Well, currently it says that to apply to receive either one of these tax breaks, you have to have
2023
it
is the
by,
sunset, I
right, by
guess.
close of next
Okay,
year.
Application.
So really we have 2 years. So based on your goal of 50% addition, you're talking notionally a couple hundred additional units, 250 maybe.
Right.
Okay, so one of my concerns, quite frankly, is the inflationary impact that this has on the housing stock that could be detrimental. I was actually in real estate in the 80s, and the government at the time, Alaska Housing Finance Corporation, subsidized interest loans down to 6%. I think it was called the HOF program, Homeowners Financial Assistance or something. And because mortgage rates at the time were 13+%. And so there was this significant interest that was savings that was granted. All the condominiums around town were, $75,000 or whatever $75,000, not all of them, but when the real estate market began to tank, that was due to kind of the economic recession, kind of post-pipeline boom, these condos, many of them were foreclosed. All of a sudden they were worth $25,000. I believe that was a classic government-induced inflation in the housing cost that didn't represent the real value of it. And when the subsidy went away, the value was back down here. Now there's other things in it, but the lesson was pretty strong, and I'll never forget it. And I guess I want to make sure that we as a community, in our efforts to meet this need for the Allison folks coming in, but also just in the community at large, that we don't kind of unknowingly walk into a deal where we're creating this inflationary environment. And I guess I'm wondering, I think, Mayor, I've talked to you a little bit and you have considered that, but can you just talk a little bit about the overall impact and how do you see this positively, negatively affecting it, or no effect?
Yeah, so I think with the 1 to 4 unit portion, that's the reason why it's such a smaller time frame. It's 2 years. So again, it's very targeted, and it's that's probably more owner occupied properties, which I think are more of the concern that you saw back at that time frame. For the larger developments, really those are investment properties. So I mean, it's possible that an owner could still live in those properties, but they have to go through some sort of commercial financing. There's no homeowner programs for 5 unit and greater. So you have to cash flow it. And so as part of that pro forma that you have to do for that, you're going to have to show how it cash flows. And I think what this does is this exemption provides you, it's a component. It's essentially, it's a reduction in your expenditure line or an increase in your cash, depending on how you want to look at that, but it in fact impacts that cash flow. So if you can show how it pencils out over the life of the loan, you're going to be just fine. And your investment in that property is less so to do with the value of the asset, more so with the income it generates. So you're toying with different things there, which is I think why the program with its extended time frame provides some really interesting dynamics to how you could propose that type of development. Because most likely you got folks that are going to finance these packages. But it's viewed through the commercial aspect of your revenue generation versus like a homeowner, which is debt to income ratios. They're just different. So, and I do apologize, I've got to run, I've got 9 o'clock, and I know you're in very good hands with Ms. O'Neall.
Madam Presiding Officer. Well, and actually we are getting near the top of the hour. Mayor Ward, thank you very much for coming.
Yes,
thank you for, and both of you, thank you for sponsoring this ordinance, putting this on the table for consideration by the community. We do have a couple of more minutes. You go ahead and bolt, sir.
Thanks.
But I would like to, are there any other questions we might have online?
I guess
All right.
I just want to wrap up by saying that we saw a lot of studies in this presentation that acknowledged that we have a housing issue, a quality of housing issue here. And the hope is that we are able, with incentives like this to increase a quality housing stock for our community into the future, and get rid of the housing stock that's costing our residents a third of their income to pay for energy. And that helps our community, and that's a really important part of this. So I think that I just wanted to kind of wrap up with that to Rick. Thanks.
Well, again, much appreciated. I know this is you all have been working on this. A lot of people have been working on this general issue for quite a long time. And so again, we really appreciate it. And this was one of the tools that was requested to be put in the toolbox by that large housing task force. Because in the end, really what we're talking about is so much of this is about investment and how can you reduce risk and increase potential profitability to help get these things over the line. Because if it's never constructive, no one ever gets to live in it. All right, and the taxing authority never gets to tax it eventually. So, all right. Well, thanks, everybody. I do want to say on the record, again, this is, if I'm not mistaken, Ms. O'Neall, this is going to be coming before the Assembly for full consideration on Thursday. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and so if it would be hoped if you are supportive of this concept, you maybe reach out, go ahead and say so. You can actually provide written comment just by going through the FNSB website. You can just Google FNSB Assembly. And there's a little link that you can email the Assembly members with just a brief statement. Also, you can go ahead and join us there in the room at the Assembly chambers if you also want to provide positive public testimony or negative. I mean, again, we're all citizens here, but again, we're encouraging positive public testimony. Well, all right, everybody, that's our show for today. Just as a bit of a look forward, there will not be a meeting next week. I'm supposed to be going down to Juneau with the chamber fly-in, so I've postponed GBEA till the following week. So please know that, again, at this point, not planning to have a meeting next week. So everybody have a great Valentine's Day with your lovies. But then the following week, we'll be having the GBEA update. Sounds good? Well, all right, everybody. Thank you, Madam Presiding Officer.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we'll see everybody hopefully on Thursday, but definitely Tuesday, 2 weeks hence. All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.